All right, hello and welcome everybody to the what is going to be a continuing thing. We are going to have to keep doing this online because, if you guys haven't been seeing it, the COVID is spiking again, and it's not plateauing yet. So, um, we're going to keep it safe and um, keep this online format for the time being. Um, I don't know if we're going to have classes in class again. Hopefully, we can still have some sort of discussion here. Um, but I'm guessing it's going to be kind of difficult to do if everyone joins. But luckily, we don't have that many people joining right now. So, with all that being said, all the finals are graded, and word of warning: my cats will sometimes interrupt. So that's just what he does. Um, but um, all the all the midterms are in, and Kevin has some stuff to say about like how it went, how and how to improve your grade in the future. Go ahead, Kevin.
All right. So, first off, one of the things I want to tell you guys about the midterm is I can tell when you're using Wikipedia. And if you use Wikipedia right, that it actually might enhance your answer, but often enough that was not the case. So often enough, what students were doing is using Wikipedia and only Wikipedia. And that's a problem because I pay close attention to the lectures and I can tell. Example, a lot of people, when they're talking about like the fall of Constantinople, would just discuss kind of like its impact on European history and how it allowed the Ottoman Empire to advance into Europe. But that's not US history. It doesn't really matter that much to US history. So when you use Wikipedia like that, I can tell. But other students would use Wikipedia and do it very well. They take what we did in class and expand on it using information from Wikipedia. Like, for example, they might have taken the Battle of Saratoga, used Wikipedia to get some additional military information to detail the campaign more. And so they're pulling from stuff from the class and using Wikipedia to enhance that. So that actually ended up helping them a lot. So Wikipedia can be your friend, but only if you use it right. Also, something I noticed a little bit, some people were almost copy pasting from sites like Wikipedia and various online encyclopedias. That's plagiarism. So do not basically be careful when you're using Wikipedia to make sure you do not just copy paste. Also, I wanted to let you guys know when it came to using stuff like Wikipedia, this time I was relatively gentle. And if you just like, for example, the Ottoman Empire thing, if you did that, you got I get like a C because it did have some sort of significance. But thing is, it says significance to U.S. history. I was being a little too nice there. That won't necessarily be the case with the final. Finally, I wanted to kind of discuss how to actually do these things because a lot of students would not discuss, would either only partly define it or not discuss significance. So what you need to do for the actual definition of the term, 5 W's: who, what, when, where, why. And then for significance, why does it matter? You could say why it matters today, why it matters in the grand scheme of American history, like the thing it may have caused that. So, like if you look at examples with Pontiac, his significance led to the proclamation line with his rebellion, which led to the American Revolution indirectly because colonists got upset. So if you can draw lines like that, your grade will be much more significantly, like you do a lot better. Finally, some of the answers, like the party system one, a lot of students did not connect that to the class whatsoever. And we're like discussing modern stuff like Republicans and Democrats. Make sure it connects to the class. In this case, we were looking for Democratic Republicans and Federalists. If you didn't mention them or the first party system at all, I couldn't give you a very good grade. So make sure everything's relevant to the class. I think that's all I have to say, Joe.
Alrighty then. So hopefully, to add on to that, the thing about using Wikipedia, like we can very easily tell, and it kind of illustrates that you're not engaging with the class or learning what we're trying to show you. And so that's the point of a test, is to test whether or not you're learning what needs to be learned. So you know, it kind of shows an open disregard for what we're doing here. That being said, we're gonna go straight to the lecture on Texas today. And just as a reminder, it will be moving to nothing but online. Oop, nope, that's not what I wanted. There we go. Because of the all the COVID stuff. All right, so today we're going to be talking about Texas. As a reminder, if you didn't see the lecture for last Tuesday because UNM canceled class, even for this online format for some reason, the lecture is online, and I even edited the audio quite a bit so that it flows a lot quicker. And that was on the Second Great Awakening. Kind of the last few weeks we'd been talking about a lot of stuff that had happened kind of in relation to the Great Awakening, but never really talking about it. It's because I was waiting for that lecture. So be sure to watch that if you haven't. It is up on Learn. But today, we're going to be talking about what kind of is a turning point for a long and slow turning point for American history, because the annexation of Texas leads us straight to the Mexican-American War. And the Mexican-American War is ultimately what brings about a huge amount of argument over slavery, which of course leads to the Civil War. So step by step, you can see that Texas becomes kind of this pivotal series of events, putting the US and Mexico on a collision course. And of course, the land gained from that collision led to the Civil War. But of course, Texas itself is kind of crazy because there's well, it's Texas. They have a tendency to, well, do their own thing. So the prior to Texas Texas becoming the Lone Star Republic, it was it went through a series of significant changes, and a lot of this has to do with American aggression. So beginning in the early 19th century, there would be a series of filibusters, which are basically private military expeditions for people who wanted to basically take Texas for themselves. But a lot of the time, it was in the name of the United States, despite it not actually having any affiliation with the United States. And a lot of this had to do with old claims from France. Because in 1685, France had accidentally landed in Texas. Um, they had uh, they were meaning to land in basically where Louisiana is today, but they ended up in Texas. And in fact, they had to stay there for a long time because their first supply ship in 1686 ended up crashing. So the colony lasted for about 3 years until in 1688 it was massacred by local Indians. Um, in fact, the Spanish were coming there to massacre the colony themselves, but the French were not on friendly terms with local Indians, and they got massacred for it. And the Spanish actually arrived only a few months later to find all the dead people. Um, and literally just a couple of years later, the Spanish themselves started to colonize Texas. Um, with so that was France's claim, and in fact, as a result of the 7 Years' War, in 1762, France officially recognized Spain's claim to Texas. But you can see that there's going to be some there's some ambiguity to claiming Texas, because people would use that French incident, that those 3 years of French colonization, as an excuse for further claims. And this especially came about in after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, because as a result of that 7 Years' War, France had lost Louisiana, but they gained it back as a result of the Third Treaty of San Ildefonso, which granted back Louisiana to France in 1800. Then Napoleon couldn't make a significant amount of imperial gains, especially when he failed to take back Haiti. So he sold it to us in 1803. And what the Louisiana Purchase entailed was actually significantly up for debate. Some would say it was literally just like what the state of Louisiana is today included, although that excluded parts of West Florida, because West Florida is actually include places like Baton Rouge today. But of course, it was in Jefferson's best interest to try to push that further than any official claims would allow. Make a grand statement about how far you could. And of course, he relied on the whole French Texas debacle to claim that that the Louisiana Purchase went all the way to the Rio Grande, and that, or Rio del Norte. Those terms are interchangeable, by the way. And in fact, a Texas official, basically what was the governor there, stated in 1805, the United States have purchased Louisiana from France, and if they succeed in establishing themselves on the limits of Texas, God keep us from their hands. The U.S. government is the most ambitious, restless, unsteady, cavilling and meddlesome government on earth. So there was a very real um there was a very real worry that um that the that Jefferson's claims would hold up. But in 1806, the U.S. Congress actually sent the army to the Sabine River, which is currently the border between Texas and Louisiana. Um, and it wasn't clear what Congress actually wanted out of that. And so this looked like there might be a war between the US and Spain over whether or not Texas was part of this Louisiana Purchase. Even though, remember, France had actually relinquished that claim in 1762. Um, but instead of turning into a major war, the area between the Sabine River and the Arroyo Hondo was made into what's called a no man's land. Um, and this wasn't by congressional appointment. This wasn't by direct order of the president or anything. It was literally just negotiated by commanders in the field. Um, and the this became the de facto border anyways, regardless of whether or not Jefferson or Monroe wanted it to go further. And so Jefferson ended up relinquishing that claim, just as the French had. But that would the military presence would remain, despite the fact that numerous private expeditions came about to try to take this land for America anyways. The first of these, which are called filibusters, which comes from the Dutch word for piracy, as in freebooter. So these are essentially considered land pirates, that they're actually trying to steal land. And keep in mind that the international penalty for piracy, well into the 19th century, was death. That no matter what, pirates were executed. So, it behooved the U.S. government to try to stop these filibusters because, it becomes quite an international incident if a bunch of Americans get executed by a foreign government. Even if they might gain some land for the U.S. So it's a bit of a tactical dance that people have to play. So the first of these was Aaron Burr's conspiracy in 1807. He had been vice president of the U.S. Then, after killing Alexander Hamilton in a duel, he kind of fell out of favor and wasn't allowed to be Jefferson's vice president after the election. But so Burr decided to start trying to gather up a bunch of people, possibly for his own filibuster expedition. It's not really clear, but the main idea was that he was going to go and take land in Texas. And lo and behold, Andrew Jackson was the one who reported him. He was tried for treason, but acquitted. But he basically became persona non grata as a result. Then, because there was so much turbulence in New Spain from 1808 to 1821, there was a war for independence, and this went through many phases since it was more than a decade of fighting. Um, and so um, a guy named Gutierrez decided to try to take advantage of that by creating an independent state in Texas, um, possibly to be annexed by the United States or to be annexed by whatever independent entity would come out of this war of independence in Mexico. Uh, Spoiler alert, it would be Mexico. But in 1812, he joined with an American in Louisiana called Francis Maggie, not Maggie, McGee, um, and they organized an expedition which left in 1812 in support of Mexican independence. They had this this green flag that you can see pictured on the slide was their symbol. And they actually managed to take over a good chunk of Texas. It was by one of the most successful freaking filibusters to that point in time, besides the one that had happened in West Florida in 1810. They had managed to take San Antonio, which is what is pictured here, and which was at that point the capital of Texas. The Spanish were completely split and kind of leaderless as a result of this, but there was a bunch of arguments over how to handle prisoners, and this ended up splitting the Gutierrez and McGee factions. And most Americans, surprisingly enough, were actually the ones arguing against killing all the Spanish officials. So there we go. So they split over all of this and ended up taking over different chunks of Texas, which allowed the Spanish to send in a pretty substantial force to fight them at Medina, which ended up being the bloodiest battle in Texas history. In 1813, 1,300 dead from this battle. So, mind you, a lot of that is just executing prisoners, because they were considered pirates and therefore executable. Then there was one further expedition that was caused by the U.S. finally negotiating that border between the U.S. and New Spain in 1819, called the Adams-Onis Treaty. And it clarified the border and basically set up where it would be all the way until the actual annexation of Texas. So Mexico would end up upholding the same treaty. But a lot of Americans still held that ideal that, like, French Texas was that buying the Louisiana Purchase meant that French Texas was theirs, even though, once again, France had relinquished that claim in 1762, and they had only been there for 3 years anyways before getting massacred. So a former U.S. Army medic named James Long started organizing an expedition, and in 1819, right as the Adams-Onis Treaty was getting signed, he launched an expedition into Galveston Bay, Galveston is where Houston is today. And declared the creation of a Republic of Texas. And he had a whole bunch of like frontiersmen and for instance, Jean Lafitte, a famous pirate from New Orleans, was a member of this, and so was Jim Bowie, who will come up again in this lecture. Um, but Jean Lafitte ended up betraying James Long, and um, he was actually working as kind of a double agent. He was the U.S. and Spain were actually working together to kind of defeat this. Um, even though it was in the U.S.'s interest, the actual government, it wasn't so much in the U.S.'s interest. So there's going to be a repeated theme of Americans taking things into their own hands, rather than what the government officially allows. But the Long expedition failed in 1819. He actually did try to send another couple of expeditions. For instance, in 1821, he arrived on what is called the Bolivar Peninsula. You might remember from a couple of lectures ago that we talked about Simon Bolivar and how he was kind of filibustering South America. One of the differences between a filibuster and a freedom fighter is that one is successful. So Bolivar was successful, and these filibusters named Bolivar Point after him because he was being fairly successful. And in fact, he made a significant inroads into Texas in 1821 with taking over several small towns. Mind you, Spanish settlement in Texas was pretty sparse, so it's not difficult to take over that much. That's part of why there were filibusters, is because, well, they were an easy target. But the Spanish managed to capture a bunch of them, and of course executed them. And that's of course where the lines remained. That Adams-Onis Treaty kept the borders of Texas where they are. So this was not too far away from Mexican independence, though. 1819 is when the Adams-Onis Treaty was signed, and 1821 is when the Mexican Empire was established. It would become a republic in 1823, but it was initially started as an empire under a guy named Iturbide. Gotta not read it and actually pronounce it like it's a Spanish word. So this led to a very different kind of dynamic between Americans and what were formerly Spanish borders, but now Mexican borders. Mexico was much more friendly in terms of trade. Prior to 1821, Americans weren't really allowed to come across that border. Hence why these filibusters were such a big deal. But things like the Santa Fe Trail, which started in Missouri, modern day Missouri, and led all the way to Santa Fe here in New Mexico, was a trade route that was established in 1821, and also a system called the impresario system became the mode in which Americans dealt with um, the Mexican government in Texas. And this, see, part of the problem with all this independence is that they had to suddenly govern a vast amount of territory. Mexico included, at this point, included much of Central America all the way to California. So just a huge swath of land. And it didn't help that that even though the 1821 Mexican Empire was supposed to be a centralized government under the leadership of Agustin Iturbide, uh, the problem was it was very fractious. There were already several rebellions throughout Mexico, and they would continually have fractiousness well into the 20th century. It was never really a solid government, partially because of the way it was founded. Hold on a second. because because it was never formally brought together under a singular government, like how our revolution was founded by the Continental Congress. They didn't have such an entity, so there was a lot of argument over who was the real leadership, and that's why Iturbide was overthrown in 1823. Hold on a second. Why can't I? Hold on a second. There we go. So, because of that fundamental weakness of Mexico, they really needed strong settlements in the north. Prior to 1823, the there is a helicopter directly above my house. Great. Prior to 1823, Comanches had been pretty well quelled by a series of agreements that that basically made it so that the Spanish government was providing them goods in exchange for not raiding. Well, that whole system fell apart as a result of Mexican independence. And so in 1823, Comanches broke those treaties and began raiding again. So this this led to an entire frontier in which that Mexico needed settlers specifically to fight Comanches, and so they would make a devil's bargain with a guy named Moses Austin. He had actually negotiated with Spain to create a settlement in what is now Austin, Texas, but that didn't go through because of, well, the entire War of Independence. But his son, and he died in 1821. So much like the actual Moses, he never he never got to see the promised land. But his son Stephen F. Austin managed to negotiate with Iturbide to create that colony anyways. And even though the act that allowed him to create that under Iturbide was officially annulled, Austin came into there with a party of people basically saying, like, but I made an agreement. I demand to see the manager. And so he like a proper Karen, he did. Um, and and Mexico actually agreed to allow him to create this colonization anyways, partially because he had a large force of frontiersmen just sitting there, possibly to start another filibuster if it didn't go his way. So in 1824, they created the General Colonization Law, which established what is called the impresario system. And essentially, an impresario would be granted a huge swath of land, which you can see in the slide here. This is where all the land grants were as of 1830. But you can see down there in pink that big thing that says Austin's colony. He was granted that huge swath of land and basically given full control over it, and he would bring people in to live there. The first batch of people were 297 families that he brought in from the United States, now known as the Old 300, because Texans don't like to count. So they would be allowed to live on the grant and essentially shore up defenses against Comanches, because the Comanches continued raiding no matter what. So a colony that was created in 1826 called DeWitt's Colony was actually completely burnt to the ground. And so this led to the need to create um, like the Texas Rangers, for instance. Their proto form was essentially to hunt Comanches. Much like we've talked about before, Rangers are normally designed specifically to hunt Indians, and the Comanches are particularly wily folks because they would range themselves hundreds, if not thousands of miles. They would raid deep into Mexico. And in fact, this led to a problem where, because Texas at this point was technically part of Coahuila, which is, if you look at the map, you can see a chunk of that little pink outline thing. Here, hold on. I think I could do this. Yay, there we go. This little pink outlined area, this is a colony that actually went into Coahuila. And this area down here is Coahuila. So Texas and Coahuila were, or Texas y Coahuila, Tejas y Coahuila, were technically the same department, but because Comanches were raiding from up here and raiding down the Rio Grande here. By the way, this map is quite inaccurate because you can notice that there's no bend in like this is supposed to be the bend in the Rio Grande, so keep that in mind. But they raid down from the Great Plains down into northern Mexico. And this made a huge separation right here, that there basically was no one living in this area. The Comanches effectively separated Tejas from Coahuila. That's why also another reason why this map is entirely inaccurate is that these grants were never actually operated. And in fact, they were supposed to go to the mountains, but like for instance, this company claimed that they actually owned Santa Fe, which, you know, a little bit of a problem there. But especially when they failed to colonize the area as a part of their agreement. So you can see there's a lot of just confusion over all this. You have basically this entire area right here is owned by Comanches. There's no one, there's no Spanish or Americans living in this area. But the Comanches are also raiding so far south that they are depopulating the entire Rio Grande. So like this entire area was depopulated as a result of all their raids. Hence why there was a separation. How do we stop the pointer? There we go. So the you had all of that going on as this impresario system began. And so there was already a lot of discontentment with the Mexican government because they weren't offering significant enough aid because of all this. And so almost immediately, these impresarios started rebelling. In 1826, an impresario named Hayden Edwards declared independence of his specific colony, calling it the Republic of Fredonia. And while the Mexican army was sent, they only sent 100 dudes to try to put down this rebellion, and so they ended up having to get help from Stephen F. Austin, who sent his own militia to quell the revolt, and it was successfully quelled. But you can already see there's quite a bit of a power imbalance here. The only reason why it wasn't a success was because another impresario helped out, and also the founding impresario. And mind you, these militias were basically just what we would call Texas Rangers today. So you have that kind of stuff going on, and part of the impresario system is that people who were colonizing these areas were supposed to abide by immigration requirements, and this became quite a source of friction because one of the immigration requirements in Mexico was that all immigrants had to convert to Catholicism, speak Spanish, and document themselves with Mexican authorities. All of those tenets would be violated repeatedly. There was a lot of illegal immigration, a lot. And so like the impresarios themselves didn't really feel the need to abide by those rules because, well, it's their colony, they'll do what they want, right? And as we saw with the Fredonian rebellion, there wasn't enough Mexican power to enforce these things. So the impresario system basically built in a bunch of rebellion and allowed for all this illegal immigration while building up a military force specifically to fight Comanches. But, you know, all they have to do is turn their guns on Mexican authorities. Another huge issue was slavery. In 1824, slavery was technically abolished by the Mexican Constitution, though it wouldn't become official until 1829. But it actually made specific exceptions for colonies that slavery was allowed in the colonies under specific circumstances. And the idea was that there would be steady abolition in Texas. But Texan slaves were allowed to be turned into indentures instead. And so they were indenturing their slaves for 10 years. If you remember the slavery lecture, this is kind of a common Southerner tactic. Remember with like Ohio and that, where they were trying to turn Ohio and Indiana and all that into slave states by having indentured servants that were really just their slaves that they had turned into indentures to go north. Well, they were doing the same thing in Texas, and that was technically legal, But you can see there's it's an underhanded tactic, and we're talking about people here, being treated as property, even though an indentured servant technically is still a free person. They don't have the right to refuse labor. Um, and so this was pretty much a way of extending slavery, despite the fact that it was illegal by the Mexican Constitution. And this led to some well, they're called the Anuak disturbances. And basically, as Texans were trying to import um, more than just slaves, but plenty of other illegal goods, but especially slaves. A Mexican official in Anuak, which is just north of Houston today, it's in the Galveston Bay, um, took took issue with this. Now, what's interesting about this guy is that his Mexican name was Juan Bradburn, but his actual name was John Davis Bradburn because he was an American. But he was an American who wanted to not have slavery. um, and so he ended up trying to stop all of this smuggling that was going on. Once again, not just because of slaves. There was plenty of other illegal goods being shipped into the Galveston Bay. But um, he tried to clamp down on it, which led to an armed rebellion in 1832. And their inciting incident was trying to repatriate slaves that were being held in custody of the Mexican government under John Davis Bradburn. And mind you, once again, this is kind of showing the fundamental weakness of Mexico and Texas, because they had to hire Americans to enforce their laws. And so you had this kind of infighting, essentially, where Americans were still seeing themselves as American. They didn't they well they were more seeing themselves as Kentuckians. It's a whole thing, but the point being that these folks were fundamentally at odds with the Mexican government. And so in 1830, Mexico officially banned all immigration into Texas, but that actually didn't stop anything, and illegal immigration continued, leading up to 30,000 Texians by 1834. 30,000. So this, of course, led to a lot of stuff in terms of disputes within Mexico, because there was remember how we said that the Mexican government was fundamentally at odds with itself, that there was a bunch of different factions, and one of these huge factions were the centralists, who wanted to centralize power rather than federalists, who wanted a more federal form of government, much like the United States. But the centralists wanted to centralize power around one person. And initially, one of those people was not Santa Anna. In fact, Santa Anna, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, actually rose to power trying to fight another Mexican president's name, whose name Bustamante. He came to power demanding Bustamante's resignation because he was a centralist, and then Santa Anna became a centralist. And he became president in 1833, and in 1834, he started trying to fight against the Congress, which had passed some liberal reforms against the Catholic Church. So he enacted a plan to repeal them. Um, so you can see there's already a system ready to fight, right? And so there was a development of a war and peace party within Texas. This was especially the case in 1832 with the anti-Bustamante um, folks who campaigned for independence. Um, hence why there were those Anuak disturbances. And then there was the peace party who wanted to kind of deal with this friction peacefully. Um, and what's really started this on a move for rebellion was that Stephen F. Austin got arrested for supposedly fomenting rebellion, even though he'd actually been arguing against it. And he wasn't released until August of 1835. So he was held for an entire year. Plus, they're all armed for fighting Comanches. So this was a recipe for disaster, which of course led to the Texas Revolution. Santa Anna in 1835 repealed the Mexico's constitution and officially converted all the states into departments with a centralized dictatorship. In December of 1835, he passed what are called the Siete Leyes, or the Seven Laws, and officially codified all this as a new constitution. So you can see there's a lot of people who will be pissed off by this because he's doing this unilaterally. It's not he just threw it out because he could. And so there were a series of rebellions throughout the entirety of Mexico, not just in Texas. The first of which was in Zacatecas, which Santa Anna led an army to put down. But Texas came next. There'd actually be a number of other rebellions. For instance, in Alta California, there'd be a rebellion against Figueroa and the creation of an autonomous California. Here in New Mexico, there was the Chimeo Rebellion in 1837. Tabasco, Rio Grande, like there's a bunch of these. In fact, one of them, the Republic of the Yucatan, actually was successful as well. So this is not just a Texan thing. But Texas was obviously the most successful. The Republic of the Yucatan would fall into civil war and end up basically annexing themselves to stop the Civil War in 1848. But with all of that, the Republic of Texas needed some sort of inciting incident to it's not the Republic of Texas yet, but Texas needed some sort of inciting incident, and that came in Gonzales. I am sorry, that is not supposed to be possible. There we go. Sorry. But so they had a bunch of soldiers that were just carousing with local populace, and one of them, we don't know why exactly, but one of them ended up butt stalking a local in Gonzales, and of course this led to a bunch of protests, and the local commander, who was actually a Federalist, but and so somewhat sympathetic to any kind of rebellion, still sent 100 dragoons to put this down. Though there was a small skirmish, the settlers ended up retreating to a small house and pulling out a cannon that had been given to them to fight Comanches. And so the commander wanted to take that cannon because obviously there's that issue of them rebellion. But they put up a flag that had a picture of the cannon, and it just said, "Come and take it." And of course, well, he couldn't do that. The cannon was the deciding factor that made sure that those dragoons were not able to fight them. And this started a series of battles throughout Texas that led to, in fact, the taking of San Antonio in October of 1835. So initially, the Texans had managed to drive out the Mexicans. By the end, by early 1836, they were pretty well established and starting to even send offensive expeditions into Matamoros, but that didn't work out. They didn't get it. They didn't make it past San Patricio, and all the expeditionaries were killed. But they basically already had control of Texas by the end of 1835. And so they formed in October of 1835 through March of 1836 in a provisional government called the Consultation. This, much like that provisional government of the United States in 1775 to 1776, it was a stopgap. But what really threw them over the line was in December of 1835, a Mexican official named Jose Maria Tornel said, "The Supreme Government has positive information that in the United States of the North, public meetings are being held with avowed purpose of arming expeditions against the Mexican nation." Basically saying that these guys are filibusters. And so he proclaimed that all people involved would be treated and punished as pirates, since they are not subject of any nation at war with the Republic, nor do they militate under any recognized flag. So this Tornel decree basically declared anyone in rebellion would be executed, like pirates. And Santa Anna had just defeated that Zacatecas rebellion, so he marched north to deal with this himself. And so he arrived in Texas in February of 1836. So one of his first things was to lay siege to San Antonio, which is where a old mission was, now called the Alamo. And for a month, they managed to hold off Santa Anna, but not really for any kind of defensive purpose, more so that they could forewarn the armies at Goliad, and or around Goliad. But no quarter was given, and Santa Anna killed everyone at the Alamo, including Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie. We've mentioned both of those guys several times in this class. Well, not Bowie several times, but this is kind of significant, right? That now it's a war of either you get massacred or surrender and you get massacred, or you manage to fight them off. This is no quarter is being given. And same thing happened at Goliad after the Battle of Coleto. those who surrendered were massacred. 400 people were massacred. Well, more than 400 were massacred at Goliad. So in the middle of all of this, on the 2nd of March, 1836, they declared independence, stating very clearly that it was because this was a violation, that the central government was a violation of their rights as impresarios, and they had been invited under certain things, the what they called the laws habituated in the land of their birth, the United States. And they came with a specific expectation, and so that was that had been abandoned by the repeal of Mexico's constitution. But the actual fighting of the Texans wasn't going so well, and so throughout the spring of 1836, the Texan army ended up fighting Santa Anna in what's called the Runaway Scrape, and essentially they were fighting on the run. It's called Runaway because they were trying to get away, and they ended up going all the way to the Sabine River, where luckily some Americans were willing to cross and join the army. And so they turned around at the Battle of San Jacinto, and just utterly massacred Santa Anna's army, killing more than 600, all the while saying, "Remember the Alamo and Goliad," because, well, that same number had been killed at the Alamo and Goliad. So they managed to defeat Santa Anna and force him to sign a treaty that acknowledging Texas. But of course, this was a treaty signed by force, and so the Mexican government would never ratify it. But supposedly he was supposed to push for Texas to remain a independent entity. So this led to this of course meant that there was an independent Republic of Texas, but they still had disputed territory. You can see on this map here that there's that disputed territory area. That's known as the Nueces Strip, and that's because it's between the Rio Grande and the Nueces. Now, the Nueces was the official boundary of Texas when it was Coahuila, Texas, but that was depopulated by Comanche raiding, and Texans had started to settle further south into the Nueces Strip. They were the only ones actually settling it. But Coahuila remained, obviously it's in Mexico's favor to keep that claim. But Texans took that even further because they thought that they owned the entirety of the Rio Grande. Remember that whole French connection. And so they would end up sending a raid into here to Santa Fe specifically to try to take it over, but that failed miserably. They also ended up having to fight Comanches quite a bit as an independent agency, as an independent state, and so they basically started a huge fight after they tried to treat with the Comanches and create some sort of peace, and at the council house negotiation, some sort of miscommunication happened, and the Comanches appeared to act aggressive, and so the Texans ended up killing 42 of them and capturing the other 35. In response, the Comanches launched their biggest raid ever, called the Great Raid. Um, but they were defeated at Plum Creek by the Texans, only to turn further south and raid into northern Mexico. So you can see the Comanches are still a huge presence in terms of all this, and they are depopulating northern Mexico, lending more credence to Texans' claim over the Nueces Strip. Then this dispute kind of stopped for a little bit in 1840 when Coahuila, Nuevo Leon, Tamaulipas, and Tamaulipas declared their own independence. So Texas ceded the Nueces Strip in order for them to create what they called the Republic of the Rio Grande. And they in fact took on a flag that looked very similar to the Texan flag, to show their allegiance. So, but this was quickly defeated in October of 1840, and so Texas continued the claim over the Nueces Strip. But from that point, there would be a series of expeditions. First, the Santa Fe expedition in 1841 sent a bunch of Texans across the Santa Fe Trail, but they ended up getting raided by Comanches and then showed up all beleaguered and were easily defeated by the local governor, Manuel Armijo, here in New Mexico. And we are running out of time. Mexico sent in a raid in 1842. They'd actually been sending little tiny raids this entire time, but in 1842 they sent in several serious invasions to try to take over Texas, or at least the Nueces Strip. That failed, and so Texas answered by sending the Muir expedition in 1842 from November to December as a retaliatory expedition into northern Mexico. But they were captured, and the POWs were not absolutely massacred. They were what's called decimated. And this is essentially, decimation is when you kill every 10th person. And so you can see here being pictured how they chose those 10 people. That 1/10 people is that they had to grab from a bag of beans, and there were 9 beans to every 1 black bean, and so anyone who grabbed a black bean was executed. So this led to another series of attacks, all of which failed. And in fact, the U.S. got involved in another expedition that they were trying to launch on Santa Fe, with U.S. Dragoons disarming them and sending them back over to Texas. And so this really shifted the fighting to the sea, where Texas started trying to trade openly, and Mexico kept trying to attack them. So they created a navy, and in 1843, the last of the major skirmishes kind of settled the matter, that the Texas Navy would remain a official force, and the Mexican Navy would not interfere. So I guess we'll leave. We have like 5 minutes left. But you can see all the way until 1843, it's not clear if Texas is even an independent entity. But the U.S., of course, would interfere with all this, which we will talk about. Well, we got about 5 minutes left. Let's try to knock a little bit of this out. When Texas was created, of course, they had to start creating um, their own laws, and so they instantly legalized slavery because remember that was one of the issues leading up to the revolution, um, and so they made it also really difficult for people of color to become um, to immigrate into Texas. In fact, the Texan Congress had to approve any person of color to immigrate into Texas, and they specifically eliminated Black and Indian peoples from the franchise and also from any kind of legal rights. Um, Also, manumission was required congressional approval as well. So they legalized slavery while making it incredibly difficult to free your slaves. And so that made Texas a very clear slave state. But from the get-go, they were looking at trying to be annexed by the U.S. But of course, that didn't go so well. Pretty much immediately, as soon as a guy named something Lamar, became president of Texas, those annexation requests fell by the wayside. But Texas wasn't exactly a clear and coherent political entity, just like how Mexico had fallen apart. They fell apart, and they had a series of internal wars where, like, dueling vigilante groups would lay claim to being able to enforce the law. This led to the Regulator and Moderator War from 1839 to 44, which killed more than 50 people. And this was purely about who could enforce the law, and basically who had claims to certain lands. Because also now they have to make new land laws because the impresario system is no longer a thing, since, well, that was one of the major reasons why they rebelled. And so there was that. And then President Sam Houston, who was a major figure, major general during the War of Independence, tried to move the capital to his town, because he was an impresario, to what is now Houston. And he tried, in trying to move this, one of the key designators of where the capital was the archives, where you kept all the documents. And so in trying to move that, this became a fight, and people were trying to were taking up sides in that. And interestingly enough, what became the deciding factor in that fight was some lady came out wheeling a cannon herself and just fired into the crowd. Didn't actually kill anybody, but literally just some lady came out and decided to fight against Houston's forces, and just fired a cannon, and that settled the issue. Nobody's willing to fight her. But Austin did keep a bunch of agents in San Antonio, specifically to keep to keep an eye on the archives and that, despite that not being it. But I think we will leave that. We will leave at that, because the what will happen next will lead directly to the Mexican-American War, and we've ran out of time. So, before we call it good, any questions? Yes, we will have class on Tuesday just like normal, but it will be on this Zoom. It should be the same link and everything. Oh, I haven't received any word about there being.
It's fall break. It's the second day of fall break, so I don't think we can have class on Tuesday.
Well, I will keep you guys apprised on that, and we will find out. I am not aware, but I will let you guys know. I will send out an email on Tuesday, so keep an eye out. All right. Well, have a good day, everyone.